Hi there, this is Delfina Morganti Hernández, and this is another episode of Founded in Transcreation, the first ever podcast on transcreation as a service where we delve into how brands cross borders. And today I was thinking if I'm going to create content consistently about transcreation, which is, I think, the most hybrid and multidisciplinary service a translator can provide, a translator with copywriting skills, with content writing skills, with a background in marketing and advertising and so on. I was thinking, why not somehow throw into this content as much creativity and diversity as possible, and that's why I thought of using this episode to talk a little bit about the status of the original, not just in transcreation, but in translation and literature and language and communication as a whole. And in order to do that, I will be having a rather remote conversation, and he will never actually know probably, but I will discussing this issue through and with an author whose work I haven't yet read, I have to confess, but by which I'm very much intrigued. In fact, I once watched a film based on one of his novels, and this author is actually Michael Cunningham. Michael Cunningham was born in November in 1952. He's an American novelist and screenwriter, and he's actually best known for his 1998 novel, The Hours, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the PEN/Faulkner Award in 1999. He's senior lecturer of creative writing at Yale University, and I have been listening to some interviews with him on YouTube recently. But the article I'm going to share with you today, I think, is a groundbreaking article, especially coming from an author, especially coming from a fiction author. I mean, somebody had to say this, what he actually wrote in this article, and it's not an article that I've read recently. I mean, I have reread it recently, but the first time I read it, I think, was about 6 or maybe 8 years ago. Yeah, about 8 years ago at least. And I was fascinated by it. And the first time I read it actually was through a translation into Spanish. Thank God for that translation. I really can't remember the name of the translator, but it was Revista Enie by Clarín, which is actually a magazine that discusses several, things, subject matters around culture in general, literature, the world. So anyway, I will read the article, and I will probably stop at some point in order to perhaps pose a question, rhetorical question, or make some comments. But I strongly recommend that, other than just listening to this podcast, if you stay with me until the end, which I hope you do, I really hope you do, I really, really strongly recommend that you read the text if you can later on, if you still haven't. And well, I'll just start reading. This article was originally published October the 2nd in 2010 by Michael Cunningham in the New York Times. So, here it goes. Found in Translation by Michael Cunningham. As the author of Las Horas de Stunden and de Juren, ostensibly the Spanish, German, and Dutch translations of my book, The Hours, but actually unique works in their own right, I've come to understand that all literature is a product of translation. That is, translation is not merely a job assigned to a translator expert in a foreign language, but a long, complex, and even profound series of transformations that involve the writer and reader as well. Translation, as a human act, is, like so many human acts, a far more complicated proposition than it may initially seem to be. Let's take as an example one of the most famous lines in literature, "Call me Ismail." That, as I suspect you know, is the opening sentence of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. We still recognize that line after more than 150 years. Still, "Call me Ismail." 3 simple words. What's the big deal? For one thing, they possess that most fundamental but elusive of all literary qualities, authority. As writers, we must, from a very opening sentence, speak with authority to our readers. It's a little like waltzing with a new partner for the first time. Anyone who is able to waltz or foxtrot or tango or perform any sort of dance that requires physical contact with a responsive partner knows that there is a first moment on the dance floor when you assess automatically whether the new partner in question can dance at all, and if he or she can in fact dance, how well. You know almost instantly whether you have a novice on your hands, and that if you do, you'll have to do a fair amount of work just to keep things moving. Authority is a rather mysterious quality, and it's almost impossible to parse it for its components. The translator's first task, then, is to re-render a certain forcefulness that can't quite be described or explained. Although the words "call me Ismail" have force and confidence alone aren't enough. "Idiot, read this" has force and confidence too, but is less likely to produce the desired effect. What else do Melville's words possess that "idiot, read this" lack? They have music. Here's where the job of translation gets more difficult. Language in fiction is made up of equal parts, meaning and music. The sentences should have rhythm and cadence. They should engage and delight the inner ear. Ideally, a sentence read aloud in a foreign language should still sound like something, even if the listener has no idea what it is he or she is being told. Let's try to forget that the words "call me Ismail" mean anything, and think about how they sound. Listen to the vowel sounds. I, soft I. 4 of them, each different and each a soft, soothing note. Listen too to the way the line is bracketed by consonants. We open with the hard k, hit the L at the end of call, and then, in a lovely act of symmetry, hit the L at the end of Ismail. Call me Arthur or call me Bob are adequate, but not, for musical reasons, as satisfying. Most readers, of course, wouldn't be able to tell you that they respond to those 3 words because they are soothing and symmetrical. But most readers register the fact unconsciously. You could probably say that meaning is the force we employ, and music is the seduction. It is the translator's job to reproduce the force as well as the music. Chiamami Ismaele. That is the Italian version of Melville's line. And the translator has done a nice job. I can tell you, as a reader who doesn't speak Italian, that those two words do in fact sound like something, independent of their meaning. Although different from the English, we have a new, equally lovely progression of vowel sounds, E, A, I, I. And those three m's, nicely spaced. If you're translating Moby Dick, that's one sentence down, approximately 1,000,000 more to go. I encourage the translators of my books to take as much license as they feel that they need. This is not quite the heroic gesture it might seem, because I've learned from working with translators over the years that the original novel is, in a way, a translation itself. It is not, of course, translated into another language, but it is a translation from the images in the author's mind to that which he is able to put down on paper. Here's a secret. Many novelists, if they are pressed and if they are being honest, will admit that the finished book is rather rough translation of the book they'd intended to write. It's one of the heartbreaks of writing fiction. You have, for months or years, been walking around with the idea of a novel in your mind, and in your mind it's transcendent, it's brilliantly comic and howlingly tragic. It contains everything you know and everything you can imagine about human life on the planet Earth. It is vast and mysterious and awe-inspiring. It is a cathedral made of fire. But even if the book in question turns out fairly well, it's never the book that you hoped to write. It's smaller than the book you'd hoped to write. It is an object, a collection of sentences, and it does not remotely resemble a cathedral made of fire. It feels, in short, like a rather inept translation of a mythical great work. The translator then is simply moving the book another step along the translation continuum. The translator is translating a translation. A translator is also translating a work in progress, one that has a beginning, middle, and end, but is not exactly finished, even though it's being published. A novel, any novel, if it's any good, is not only a slightly disappointing translation of the novelist's grandest intentions, it is also the most finished draft he could come up with before he collapsed from exhaustion. It's all I can do not to go from bookstore to bookstore with a pen, grabbing my books from the shelves, crossing out certain lines I've come to regret and inserting better ones. For many of us, there is not what you could call a definitive text. This brings us to the question of the relationship between writers and their readers, where another act of translation occurs. I teach writing, and one of the first questions I ask my students every semester is, who are you writing for? The answer 9 times out of 10 is that they write for themselves. I tell them that I understand, that I go home every night, make an elaborate cake, and eat it all by myself, by which I mean that cakes and books are meant to be presented to others. And further, that books, unlike cakes, are deep, elaborate interactions between writers and readers, albeit separated by time and space. I remind them as well that no one wants to read their stories. There are a lot of other stories out there, and by now, in the 21st century, there's been such an accumulation of literature that few of us will live long enough to read all the great stories and novels, never mind the pretty good ones. Not to mention the fact that we, as readers, are busy. We have large and difficult lives. We have variously jobs to do, spouses and children to attend to, errands to run, friends to see. We need to keep up with the current events. We have gophers in our gardens. We are taking extension courses in French or wine tasting or art appreciation. We are looking for evidence that our lovers are cheating on us. We are wondering why in the world we agreed to have 40 people over on Saturday night. We are worried about money and global warming. We are TiVo-eyeing 5 or 6 of our favorite TV shows. What the writer is saying essentially is this: make room in all that for this. Stop what you're doing and read this. It had better be apparent from the opening line that we are offering readers something worth their while. I should admit that when I was as young as my students are now, I too thought of myself as writing either for myself, for some ghostly ideal reader, or at my most grandiose moments, for future generations. My work suffered as a result. It wasn't until some years ago, when I was working in a restaurant bar in Laguna Beach, California, that I discovered a better method. One of the hostesses was a woman named Helen, who was in her mid-40s at the time and so seemed to me to be just slightly younger than the ancient mariner. Helen was a lovely, generous woman who had 4 children and who had been left abruptly and without warning by her husband. She had to work and work and work. She worked in a bakery in the early mornings, typed manuscripts for writers in the afternoons, and seated diners at the restaurant nights. Helen was an avid reader, and her great joy at the end of her long, hard days was to get into bed and read for an hour before she caught the short interlude of sleep that was granted her. She read widely and voraciously. She was, when we met, reading a trashy murder mystery, and I, as the only young and pretentious might do, suggested that she try Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, since she liked detective stories. She read it in less than a week. When she had finished it, she told me, "That was wonderful." "Thought you'd like it," I answered. She added, "Dostoevsky is much better than Ken Follett." "Yup." Then she paused. "But he's not as good as Scott Turow." Although I didn't necessarily agree with her about Dostoevsky versus Turow, I did like very much that Helen had no school-inspired sense of what she was supposed to enjoy more and what less. She simply needed what any good reader needs: absorption, emotion, momentum, and the sense of being transported from the world in which she lived and transplanted into another one. I began to think of myself as trying to write a book that would matter to Helen, and I have to tell you, it changed my writing. I'd seen rather suddenly that writing is not only an exercise in self-expression, it is also more importantly a gift we as writers are trying to give to readers. Writing a book for Helen or for someone like Helen is a manageable goal. It also helped me to realize that the reader represents the final step in a book's life of translation. One of the more remarkable aspects of writing and publishing is that no two readers ever read the same book. We will all feel differently about a movie or a play or a painting or a song, but we have all undeniably seen or heard the same movie, play, painting, or song. They are physical entities. A painting by Velázquez is purely and simply itself, as is Blue by Joni Mitchell. If you walk into the appropriate gallery in the Prado Museum, or if someone puts a Joni Mitchell disc on, you will see the painting or hear the music. You have no choice. Writing, however, does not exist without an active, consenting reader. Writing requires a different level of participation. Words on paper are abstractions, and everyone who reads words on paper brings to them a different set of associations and images. I have vivid mental pictures of Don Quixote, Anna Karenina, and Huckleberry Finn, but I feel confident they are not identical to the images carried in the mind of anyone else. Helen was clearly not reading the same Crime and Punishment I was. She wasn't looking for an existential work of genius. She was looking for a good mystery, and she read Dostoevsky with that thought in mind. I don't blame her for it. I like to imagine that Dostoevsky wouldn't either. What the reader is doing then is translating the words on the pages into his or her own private, imaginary lexicon, according to his or her own interests and needs and levels of comprehension. Here, then, is the full process of translation. At one point, we have a writer in a room struggling to approximate the impossible vision that hovers over his head. He finishes it with misgivings. Sometime later, we have a translator struggling to approximate the vision, not to mention the particulars of language and voice of the text that lies before him. He does the best he can, but is never satisfied. And then finally, we have the reader. The reader is the least tortured of this trio, but the reader too may very well feel that he is missing something in the book, that through sheer ineptitude he is failing to be a proper vessel for the book's overarching vision. I don't mean to suggest that writer, translator, and reader are all engaged in mass exercise in disappointment. How depressing would that be? And untrue. And still, we as a species, are always looking for cathedrals made of fire. And part of the thrill of reading a great book is the promise of another yet to come. A book that may move us even more deeply, raise us even higher. One of the consolations of writing books is the seemingly unquenchable conviction that the next book will be better, will be bigger and bolder and more comprehensive and truer to the lives we live. We exist in a condition of hope. We love the beauty and truth that come to us, and we do our best to tamp down our doubts and disappointments. We are on a quest and are not discouraged by our collective suspicion that the perfection we look for in art is about as likely to turn up as is the Holy Grail. That is one of the reasons we humans, are not only the creators, translators, and consumers of literature, but also its subjects. The end. So that's the end of Michael Cunningham's article, dating back to October 2010. So 10 years after, I still find this article exquisite. So much so that I think it should be taught at universities, at translation studies, institutes, universities, everywhere we should be using, I humbly think, this text to open up that door that we've closed long ago when we decided that the original is sacred as such. Is there an original? Can we think of an absolute original after this text? I don't think so. And Michael Cunningham is not alone, of course. There's Jorge Luis Borges too, also saying this famous quote. I don't have it here with me, but he says something like, draft 4 or 5 of a text is not necessarily better than draft 3 or draft 6. I mean, with this, I think he was trying to say that it's all about drafts. It's all about sketches. It's all about scribbling things that we think are the definitive text, and we pass on to another subject in this endless circle. That's literature, that's language, that's communication. And when we do it with misgivings, with doubts and disappointments, as in the words of Michael Cunningham, who used a lot of alliteration in this article. But actually, can we actually say that what we have produced is a definitive text? Can we actually claim now that every translation is less important, less perfect, less great than the source text? When I read this text by Michael Cunningham 10 years ago, I decided I would stop talking about originals. I would stop referring to source texts as the original. And I never used that word again, not seriously, when referring to what I refer to now as the source text. The text on which my work as a translator is always based, from which it springs, which gives birth to my job, to the fact that I exist as a translator in the economy. But also, when I discovered Transcreation, I realized Transcreation is that place where Michael Cunningham's stand concerning the source text is actually most apparent, right? In Transcreation, we have not just the right and permission to stray from the source, but also the duty to do so. In most cases, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about Transcreation. So, now that you're already thinking about this, or rethinking it, again, I'd like to invite you to find this text, which is actually called Found in Translation. You can Google it. It was published by Michael Cunningham in the New York Times. And, well, as you can see, I have delved into more questions than answers here. But the idea is to start thinking, if we're going to try so hard, as most of us are in the translation industry, to set them apart and call them by their names, translation and transcreation and localization, then we're going to have to start by questioning, I think, the status of the source text as an absolutely perfect original. And Michael Cunningham's text comes quite in handy, if you ask me, to do that. That was another episode of Founded in Transcreation, where I allowed myself to stray from the title of this podcast and talk about a bigger issue that affects not just transcreation and transcreators, but translators and writers and readers and communicators alike. So stay tuned for another episode where we'll start delving back into how brands cross borders. Stay tuned.